السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل جيفري بلانكفورت المؤرخ والصحافي والمصور الأميركي اليهودي المناهض للصهيونية كان قد ربح في شباط فبراير عام 2002 دعوى ضد ما يعرف بعصبة مناهضة التشهير اليهودي ADL لتجسسه عليه بشكل غير قانوني والتجسس على أفراد ومجموعات سياسية مسالمة أخرى، بما في ذلك حركات مناهضة التمييز العنصري والناشطون فيها من المعارضين لسياسات إسرائيل في الضفة الغربية المحتلة وغزة، والمناهضون لسياسات التمييز العنصري لحكومة جنوب أفريقيا سابقا. يطيب لنا أن نرحب مجددا بجيفري بلانكفورت الذي ينضم إلينا من كاليفورنيا، حيث نستكمل حديثنا عن اللوبي الإسرائيلي ونتعمق أكثر في إماطة اللثام عن شبكة مراكز الفكر والأبحاث والمجموعات الموالية لإسرائيل والتي تهيمن على خاصرة واشنطن وواجهتها. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Jeffrey Blanckfort, American Jewish historian, radio host, writer, and photojournalist. Welcome again to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, Jeff.
Very happy to be with you again.
Always a pure pleasure to have you. Well, in this edition, Jeff, let's delve into unveiling, highlighting, and dissecting the network of pro-Israel bodies and think tanks that dominate the Washington Beltway. Your article, The Influence of Israel and its American Lobby over the U.S., Middle East policy, of course, contains the clearest explanation of the difference between the narrow definition of the pro-Israel lobby, the registered lobbies who legally bribe politicians, and the broad definition of the Israel lobby, which includes federations, organizations, think tanks, etc. Devoted, of course, all these devoted to working on Israel's behalf, and why those groups must legitimately be considered part of the Israel lobby. Group number one, the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, which you successfully sued. How did it start, and the nature of its work, the ADL, its connection and cooperation with police chiefs and law enforcement officials across the country? Let's critically deconstruct the key role of the ADL in the Israel lobby and its agenda as a whole, please.
The ADL began in 1913 after a young Jewish businessman named Leo Frank was accused of murdering a young white girl in the South. And the Jewish community said, of course, without knowing that he was innocent. People in the town where this happened lynched him, took him from the jail, and hung him. He's the only Jew known to have been lynched in the United States, where tens of thousands of black men, young black men, have been lynched. But on the basis of that one incident, the B'nai B'rith Jewish organization started a group called the Anti-Defamation League, which was designed to defend Jews when they were under attack. But from the very beginning, it became a spy agency.
You are a Jew, Jeff.
Yes, it's back in the 30s.
And they were spying on you.
It's spied on me. And we were privileged because its number one spy in the United States, a man named Roy Bullock, joined our organization that I and a friend of mine started called Labor Committee on the Middle East, which we wanted to change the direction of American labor movement, which has been a cornerstone of the Israel lobby from the very beginning. Unfortunately. And the very first meeting Roy Bullock attended, and Roy had already infiltrated the American Arab Anti-Discrimination League, and so I knew him, and my co-founder Steve Zeltzer of the Labor Committee, and I also did work around anti-apartheid work in South Africa, and Roy Bullock had infiltrated South African anti-apartheid groups because he was also working for the South African Intelligence Agency, spying on the anti-apartheid movement for not only the ADL, but for South Africa. And this later would help keep me on my radio program. But
what didn't the ADL want you to talk about, Jeff?
What they did was got information from evidently the federal government. Much of it was misinformation. They had me marrying someone I never met or heard of. They had me making trips to Cuba and Vietnam, which I never made. I tried to, but never made. But what happened is I received information in the mail, a letter saying that this Roy Bullock had been working for the Anti-Defamation League as a spy for 25 years. So Steve and I confronted him with this letter and asked him why he, if it was true or not, and why did he suddenly or appear quite frequently at Palestinian gatherings around the country. And he said he was an art collector, and it was just by coincidence he would be in a city where Palestinians would be having a conference. And so he gave me the names of the art galleries just so I could check to see if this was true. Well, Steve and I were convinced after meeting with Roy that he was in fact an agent for the ADL. We tried to tell other groups who were working for Palestine about it. They didn't want to believe us. And so he continued doing his work within the groups. And so in 1992, there was a revelation that a San Francisco policeman had been spying and working for Israel, giving information to them on the Nation of Islam. And I had a hunch that this Roy Bullock had some connection. So I called a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, and I said, does the name Roy Bullock mean anything to you? And he said, boy, does it. Anyway, this led to the exposure of Bullock as a spy for the ADL. It was an embarrassing moment for the ADL.
Sure. What, Jeff, in terms of ADL metrics, the new anti-Semitism actually means?
Anybody who criticizes Israel, anyone, they do polls. The ADL does polls to find people's opinions. And one question they always ask, do you think Jews have too much power? And anyone who thinks that Jews have too much power or might have too much power that's considered to be an anti-Semitic answer. When in fact, Jews have too much power, inordinate power, that's far beyond their proportion to the membership or their percentage in the population, and particularly when you consider there's only a minority of Jews who wield this power.
Jeff, how does the work and the various functions of the ADL benefit the Americans?
The American people?
Yes.
The ADL is, unfortunately, what they do is put a coating over what is actually being done by the Zionist movement in the United States. And what they do is, anti-Semitism, I should say, is the glue that holds the Jewish community together. What I mean is that the fear of anti-Semitism is used by Jewish organizations to keep Jews who might otherwise criticize Israel's behavior silent because they don't want to provoke anti-Semitism. The amount they have reports, periodic reports about how many anti-Semitic acts there are. And they claim that there's more acts of anti-Semitism against Jews than against Muslims in the United States, which is ridiculous because every time somebody would draw a swastika on a wall, that's considered to be an anti-Semitic act, even though nobody has been hurt.
And any criticism of Israel is considered as an anti-Semitic act. Allow me to take you to group number two, the American Jewish Committee. What is this body? How does it operate? And since the late 1990s, what is its main task? The American Jewish Committee, please.
The American Jewish Committee is the oldest Jewish organization. It's considered to be the foreign policy arm of the Israel lobby and is virtually unknown and by activists around the pro-Palestinian movement. But the head of their organization, David Harris, for years would go around the world lobbying particularly against Iran, trying to warn foreign leaders that Iran was a threat to the world. And this goes back to the 90s. They would run ads in the U.S. press showing Iran and big targets and indicating that Iran was a threat to the United States. But they were also work with minority groups in the United States, African Americans and also Latinos, because winning the leadership of those groups over to the side of Israel is very key. For example,
the Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus.
The Black Caucus, if Malcolm X was alive today, he would not stop criticizing the Congressional Black Caucus, which in a sense is an arm of the Israel lobby. To such a degree that even when Israel was selling arms to South Africa, the Black Caucus could not say a word against Israel for doing that. And when the great liberal hero of the San Francisco Bay Area, Ron Dellums, became the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in 1988, he pulled a plank out of the anti-apartheid legislation that would have penalized Israel for the $800 million a year in arms it sold to South Africa. And this was reported only in a small Washington Times paper in Washington, and at our Middle East Labor Bulletin that I edited, and another magazine called Israeli Foreign Affairs. It was ignored by the anti-apartheid movement. And so at one point, there was a big meeting in University of California in Berkeley, several hundred people, and I was able to ask him how, under pressure, was he obligated to pull that plank out of the anti-apartheid legislation that would have penalized Israel. And he drew himself up and said, well, I object to the terms obligated and pressured. But then he told the audience how one Democrat after another had signed the legislation. Originally said, if you don't take that plank out of the bill, you have to take my name off the bill. And there were a number of Black South African exiles sitting as guests, his guests, in the front row. I was in the back. And a friend of mine who was sitting behind them said when they heard Dellums say this, that he had actually betrayed them, their mouths fell open. They couldn't believe it. But yet...
Do they have the same effect today on the Black Congressional Caucus and the Latino Congressional Caucus?
Yes, they do. It's as bad as ever. Jim Clyburn, who is from South Carolina, is the epitome of what they call Uncle Tom. He actually delivered the presidency to Joe Biden, who is a proud Zionist by his own admission. I wrote an article in 2010 for Counterpunch magazine called
Yes.
In Israel's Service, because they're showing the history of Joe Biden
True.
as a supporter of Israel.
Allow me, we talked in the first part of our discussion about AIPAC, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which was founded in 1959. With each passing year, the organization gets bigger and stronger, with a base in Washington, offices across the country, over 100,000 energized members, and staff, of course, and every and each U.S. presidential candidate has to pay homage through this body to Israel. Why, Jeff?
Well, first of all, the Democratic Party has been dependent since at least World War II, for the majority of its major funding comes from wealthy Jews. This is undisputed by all sides, and so when you're running for office in the United States, money talks more than any other place.
Of course,
it's legalized bribery, and this is it's something that is considered part of the game, but every politician has to play it. So when you have you're running for office, you're looking for funding, you have to start making pro-Israel statements. As a matter of fact, when you're a member of Congress, you're going to run, someone from AIPAC comes and tells you that they will write a statement for you if you don't want to write it. Cynthia McKinney was one brave member of Congress,
true,
who exposed this and said she was not about to support Israel or write this letter. But this is what happens. You just had an election recently in Ohio where a radical black woman named Nina Turner was running for Congress. She was a well-known state senator. She was winning in the polls, and suddenly Jews from all over the United States started pouring money into the campaign of her opponent, a woman named Sherrod Brown, who was totally, openly pro-Israel. And that caused Brown to win the election, and now she is the leading recipient of any member of Congress for funds.
True.
So this is a ticket for opportunists, black or white, to become successful. Is you pledge yourself to Israel, and
yes,
and you know you're gonna get the money.
True. It's all about the money, after all, Jeff. WINIP, or the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Campus Watch, other groups. Why are all these bodies obsessed with Hezbollah, with a never-ending stream of propaganda designed to convince the political class and the media that Hezbollah is a threat to the U.S.?
Well, the one thing that Hezbollah twice has defeated Israel. After 18 years, the Israeli Defense Forces had to, with their tail between their legs,
the Israeli Occupation Forces.
Yes, had to withdraw in 2000 because of the number of casualties that Hezbollah was inflicting on the Israeli military. And then in 2006, I didn't think Israel was going to invade, because the Israeli army back in 1973, when they fought with Syria, they thought they were an army that was trained to fight. But over the years, they became an army that was used to occupy Palestinians who were not in a position to fight back. And so I was telling people that if Israel crosses into Lebanon, they're going to be shot at, and they're going to turn around and run. And this is what happened. At the point where they could not move their troops up on the ground, they had to do it by helicopter. There was one tank in which the crew deserted, and I saw it in Beirut at the Hezbollah Museum, which was a star attraction, the museum. This was a tank, by the way, that the Israelis planned to sell to NATO. And the very first tank that crossed into Lebanon was blown up. That was a major blow. So with the Israel Defense Forces, so-called, are considered close to God by the Israelis. Everyone loves the Israeli Defense Forces there. So for the Israeli Defense Forces to be defeated twice, and the head of the Israeli army, Dan Halutz, had to resign because his IDF was such a failure in 2006.
But Jeff, why are these bodies like the WINIP and the Campus Watch and the Foreign Policy Initiative and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, JINSA, JDL, all of these groups are so much obsessed with Hezbollah?
This is the defeat of their vaunted so-called elite forces. They have these elite brigades. The defeat so rankles Israel and its supporters that they can't get over it. In fact, Hezbollah is the main target of Israel before Iran, in my estimation. For that reason, in the Israeli press, they're constantly talking about the next war with Hezbollah as if they're talking about the monsoon season or the rainy season, as if a war has to happen. But they need that in their mind because they have been unable to defeat Hezbollah. And Hezbollah obviously is more experienced. Should it happen again, Israel would have to count on the U.S. Air Force or the planes provided by U.S. taxpayers because they're obviously not going to be able to win on the ground.
Right. Jeffrey Blankenford, American journalist, historian, and political activist, thank you very much for blowing the whistle on these lobbying groups and talking in complete depth. Always a pleasure to have you, Jeff.
My pleasure to be with you and to see you again.
Always welcome. Same here. ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.